Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for today's MDICx webinar. My name is Liliana Rincon Gonzalez. I'm the Program Director for Clinical Science and for the Science of Patient Input Initiative here at MDIC. It is my pleasure to host this webinar on our recently released report on best practices for communicating benefit, risk, and uncertainty for medical devices. In today's webinar, I will introduce the speakers, followed by a presentation by our working group chair, who will provide an overview of the project, followed by a presentation by the report's main writer on the key findings of the report. Lastly, a professional heart patient and patient advocate will share her experience with these types of communications. Then we will open the webinar for questions. Please use the Q&A box on your screen to type your questions. I will read each of the questions so the panelists can answer them. Finally, I just want to let everyone know that the recording and slides will be available on our website, and the people who register for the webinar will get an email with the link in the next week or so. Before we get started with our session, I would like to take a moment to introduce today's speakers. First, we have Scott Goetz. He's a Senior Advisor for Health Economics and Outcomes Research Medical Devices at Abbott Laboratories. His current role involves the design and execution of clinical and observational studies with patient-reported and economic outcomes. Prior to joining Abbott, Dr. Goetz worked at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, where he conducted research and advised senior leadership on a wide variety of high-priority public health issues. He also chairs the Communication Working Group for the Science of Patient Input here at MDIC. Then we have Wendy Selig. Wendy is founder and CEO of WSCollaborative, a firm that focuses on defining and implementing strategies for establishing winning cross-sector collaborations in the healthcare arena. Wendy has held leadership positions with the Melanoma Research Alliance, the American Cancer Society, and the American Cancer Society Cancer Action Network, the National Coalition of Cancer Research, and Rising Tide Foundation for Clinical Cancer Research. She's a consultant with MDIC. Finally, we have Heidi Dohse. Heidi is a professional patient advocate and heart patient. She's also the founder and CEO of Tour de Heart. In 1982, Heidi was diagnosed with a rare heart arrhythmia. She underwent a successful AV ablation procedure, leaving her heartbeat 100% pacemaker dependent. With the help of her pacemaker, wearable devices, and mobile apps, Heidi has the insights she needs to compete in endurance cycling events around the world. In November 2019, she completed her first Ironman. Heidi is passionate about improving patient outcomes and uses her athletic events as a way to inspire other heart patients and showcase what is possible. Tour de Heart is a nonprofit that provides information on using digital health tools and apps to empower individuals to live their best life. With that, I turn over to our first speaker.
Thank you very much, Liliana, and thank you everybody for coming and expressing an interest in the group that in the study that our working group has been putting together on best practices for communicating benefits, risk, and uncertainty for medical devices. My name is Scott Goetz. I am the Senior Advisor of Health Economics and Outcomes Research at Abbott. And as Liliana mentioned, I had the honor of chairing this working group as we worked on this project. I want to talk a little bit today about why we decided to do the project and who this project is for. So the vision of the MDIC Science of Patient Input Steering Committee is to advance the art and science of patient engagement in regulatory science, including integrating the patient's perspective and preference in the design, clinical development, and regulatory review of innovative medical technologies. Really, communication with patients is key to achieving this vision. Patient engagement is valuable throughout the medical device life cycle. Only when risks, benefits, and uncertainties of medical devices are clearly communicated to patients are we then able to incorporate the patient values and preferences in device design, clinical development, and regulatory review. And prior to this project, there was little guidance on communicating risk, benefits of uncertainty specifically tailored to medical device. And so we saw a gap where we can do some work for the clinical device community. What were the study aims? We wanted to familiarize medical device stakeholders with best practices for communicating benefits, risks, and uncertainty to patients and providers. We wanted this to be a practical resource, not something that is overly academic or relies too much on industry jargon. We wanted this to be a broadly usable resource where people throughout the medical device ecosystem could come and use this as a tool to improve their ability to communicate. To that end, we decided to include real-world case studies so that stakeholders could see the principles we're discussing put into operation in the real world. Finally, we wanted to identify knowledge gaps, areas that we need to learn more so that we can effectively communicate risks, benefits, and uncertainties to medical device patients. Who is this study for? Well, broadly speaking, it's for everybody. It's for everybody who has anything to do with the medical device industry and regulators and providers. So we hope that investigators will use this as a resource to make sure that trial participants are fully informed of the risks and benefits and of uncertainty when they enroll in a trial. We want regulators to use this. Regulators consider content for device communications, including device labels. Clinicians can use this who want to make sure that patients understand the benefits, risk, and uncertainty of a particular therapy at the point of care delivery. Industry professionals can use this who want to support their companies in developing appropriate materials and messaging about their products. Patient advocacy group organizations who want to educate their constituency about treatment options that include the use of medical devices. And finally, payers who are evaluating evidence, data, and claims and communicating these with patients. So this study has been in development for some time. The study was first proposed back in 2017, and it began with Stephanie Christopher as the program director for MDIC and Heather Howell as the committee chair for the science of patient input. And so we owe a great debt to Heather and Stephanie for the work they put in on this paper. It started in 2017 for the reasons that I've already outlined. There was a gap about how to communicate specifically to medical device patients. In 2018, MDIC commissioned a literature review from Exponent to study the best practices in communicating risks, benefits, and uncertainty. This literature review from Exponent covered a variety of different studies, not just in medical device, but it looked in the drug and biologic space, it looked in public health, it looked in psychology, it looked in communication journals, and really gave a broad overview of what are the evidence-based best practices for communicating risk, benefits, and uncertainty. And this study helped the working group understand what was already known, what was out there. We then used this white paper from Exponent as a jumping off point to draft a best practices document that could be focused on and useful to professionals working in the medical device space. In 2019, we completed our first draft of this document and we sent it out for public comment, and many people provided useful comments to us, and we were able to incorporate many of those comments into the ultimate final draft of the paper. During this time, and because of the public comments and some of the discussions we were having internally, we recognized the importance of incorporating case studies so that our stakeholders could actually see tangible examples of where these principles can be applied. And so that was done in early 2020, and we were able to finally publish the manuscript on November 11th on the MDIC website. And I'll notice that this timeline takes us up to our current date, but our work here really isn't over. Our goal now is to make sure that as many people as possible know about this guidance, that they understand this guidance, and that hopefully they're able to apply this guidance to better communicate and better get the voice of patients involved in regulatory decision-making of medical devices. Finally, I really want to acknowledge that this is a team effort, that the Medical Device Innovation Consortium has really filled its role as a place for collaboration. We had academics on this project, we had industry on this project, we had regulators on this project, and we had support from MDIC staff members throughout. So I want to take a moment and thank the people who are listed on this slide here. I want to thank specifically the MDIC staff members and contractors who kept the ball rolling. They really keep an eye on the projects and make sure we meet deadlines. I want to thank the Science of Patient Input Steering Committee. The steering committee was very responsive. They provided key guidance and insights at very important stages of the product and the project. So I want to say thank you to the Science of Patient Input Steering Committee. And finally, I want to thank my fellow communication working group members for their diligent efforts. You know, for a lot of us, we have other jobs that are kind of our main job, and it's a treat for us when we get to work on the MDIC stuff. And so I want to thank the communication working group members for taking the time to review the evidence, to write the paper, to edit drafts. And I think that we have a project that we can be very proud of. So with that, I would like to turn the time over to Wendy Selig, who's going to discuss the main takeaways of the Patient Input Communications Report. Thank you, Wendy.
Great. Thank you so much, Scott. And thank you, Liliana. And thank you to MDIC and everybody that Scott just thanked. Again, I am going to walk through over the next couple of minutes some of the key aspects and highlights within this report. And it's been my pleasure to work on this project over the last year or so to help bring it to fruition. And as part of my overall work with MDIC, it's been a lot of fun and I think a very rewarding activity. So I just want to acknowledge one of the things that Scott said in setting up this talk, that we looked at and borrowed from and leveraged a wide variety of resources that are out there through the literature review, not only in the device field, but also more broadly in overall medical product development. And we did borrow, where possible, from experience and expertise in the drug development landscape and the biologics landscape, and trying to bring them to the unique circumstance of medical devices. So the report itself is organized in several sections, and I'm just briefly going to walk through with some highlights here, and then we'll have time hopefully for some questions once we finish our presentation, if there are any areas of specific interest for those of you who are listening. So in the first section, we start with talking about opportunities for communicating information around benefit, risk, and uncertainty. And there are two broad contexts we focus on. So first, the clinical context. And this is, as it says, in the confines of clinical care for patients. So among the different opportunities are recruitment and consent of individuals to participate in a clinical trial. For example, there's quite a bit of communication that happens in that area. Secondly, informing the content of a product label for a device that is already commercially available. Again, this happens through the regulatory process and becomes an important communication opportunity with patients and providers about benefit, risk, and uncertainty. Thirdly, in supportive discussions and shared decision-making among healthcare providers and patients where and when care is being delivered. And then fourth, in circumstances where there are changes being made to a device or there's some sort of notification around a recall or other important update to information about a device that's already being used by patients. Next slide. The non-clinical context is in some ways equally as important to consider. And here, this is all the other communication that happens out there in the universe when it comes to medical device. And certainly in the modern world with technology and the extraordinary amount of information that comes to patients, flows to patients through the internet, through social media platforms, within the patient advocacy constituency communities, and in a peer-to-peer environment through mentorship that exists among patients and caregiver communities, when patients are talking to one another about their experience and sharing information back and forth. So we thought about communication in broadly in the clinical setting and the more controlled setting, perhaps you might think of it, and the non-clinical context, which is sort of the big wraparound of everything that goes on out there that flows in all directions. Next slide, please. So within those two big sort of frames of clinical and non-clinical, we then looked in the report at some more specific settings that we could think about, that we could define. So clinical research and regulatory review, the clinical trial setting, developing information that will ultimately be brought to the regulators. So that was one. Secondly, inclusion of patient preference information in product labeling. So this is a very important aspect that Scott mentioned, and increasingly we are seeing the opportunity for product labels to include the kind of information that's being developed that really reflects things that matter to patients and that help inform how patients might make decisions. And here, benefit, risk, and uncertainty is extremely important. Thirdly, in the shared decision-making setting, and that sort of ties in with the fourth bullet, which is patient decision aids. So these are tools I'll talk a little bit more about a little bit later, that are created by a variety of stakeholders that try to summarize and communicate in lay terms information to help patients make decisions, information to help patients and their physicians conduct a successful shared decision-making process. Additionally, there's a whole array of communication that happens in the direct-to-consumer advertising setting. Then there's what happens when patients and providers and caregivers and others go out and search online for health information. That is also connected to what can be found in social media channels, either what is publicly available or sometimes through closed Facebook or other types of groups where people can compare information, share information, and communicate about these topics. And lastly, and importantly, the patient advocacy organization setting, if you will, where there's an opportunity for a trusted entity like a patient advocacy group to be communicating with its constituency about these topics. Next slide. So section 2 of the report talks about key concepts, and some of these terms I think are very familiar. We tend to use them as if everybody knew what we meant when we said them, but each of the terms that you see here on the screen has a very precise definition that it's important to understand as you think about best ways to communicate. So benefit, harm, and risk, and patient preference information, these have all been explored quite extensively by MDIC, by FDA, by a number of other entities as this move toward being able to help patients make the best decisions and also really structure the whole development of medical products with patient views in mind. Risk tolerance and uncertainty attitude may be a little bit more technical, and then shared decision-making and patient decision aids. So I encourage you to take a look at the definitions in the report in section 2, and we'd be happy to answer questions about these if you have them. Next slide. So in section 3 of the report, we sort of dive in to key factors and things that should be considered as you start to think about this work. So communication in the clinical setting, there are 3 really important aspects here. They break out as relevant provider characteristics, so things about the clinician in terms of their expertise, their experience, their training, how they approach shared decision-making, all of those aspects are important. Secondly, it's very important to think about the characteristics of the patient that are receiving these communications, involved in these communications. Clearly, there are a variety of demographic issues and aptitude issues and experiential issues that go into who patients are in that circumstance, and that will help to define how they receive communications and whether communications about benefit, risk, and uncertainty can be successful. So taking that into account. And then thirdly, the message itself. So components of the message really do matter. Not only the content of what is being presented, but also how sometimes very technical statistical concepts are presented, the format of the message, the framing of the message, the order in which things are presented, and the types of approaches that are used to communicate, again, potentially highly technical things in a way that a patient can not only understand it, but sort of take it in and be able to use it to make a good decision or to decide on a course of action. Next slide, please. So section 4 then starts to present best practices and available tools for device developers. And as I said at the beginning, we drew heavily on pulling out things that are in the literature, that are out in the public domain, and trying to synthesize them in a way that would be useful, especially for a device arena. So in terms of an overall approach, here are some kind of considerations, things to think about, and maybe some tips, best practice tips that, that we extracted. So avoiding solely verbal descriptions of uncertainty. So using multifaceted ways of presenting uncertainty, including numbers and percentages and visuals and so forth. Avoiding the use of fractions, decimals, and different denominators when presenting risks of multiple treatments, because that tends to make it unnecessarily confusing. Describe the benefits and risks in absolute scales instead of relative terms. There are times when use of relative comparators might make sense, but as an overall approach, you know, being as definitive as possible when you can do so, it probably makes the most sense as a place to start. Using multiple formats simultaneously to ensure that you're giving the most opportunity for a variety of different types of patients to really be able to understand what's being presented. Describing uncertainty in both positive and negative frames to avoid any cognitive bias. And then whatever communication format you end up with, really pre-testing it with a group that matches to the extent possible the population you're trying to reach, to make sure that you are on the right track and adjust where necessary. Next slide. So I mentioned earlier the importance of patient decision aids, and there has been a lot written, and there are significant resources out there around patient decision aids, and increasingly a variety of stakeholders are working on their own and also in collaboration to help create these tools to help a patient and a caregiver and a family, sometimes in working with their provider, to work through a decision that needs to be made about a treatment choice, and perhaps in this case about using a medical device or selecting the right medical device for that circumstance. Important elements of this process are in the report and summarized here. So the process of developing such a decision aid, the importance of having participation of stakeholders in developing, I mentioned earlier, pre-testing things with patients. That's the best way to know that you're on the right track, is to actually involve patients in the process, gathering, selecting, and appraising the evidence to inform the content, and then ultimately, once you've deployed a patient decision aid, really testing it, evaluating how well it's working. The next set of bullets include a variety of things that a good patient decision aid should include. And you'll see some of these appear again towards the end of my talk today as aspects that we really want to highlight and give people an opportunity to have some experience working with. So I'm not going to go into these now, I'll come to them at the end. Next slide. Additionally, we talk in the report about ways to appropriately and successfully leverage online resources. So here again are some tips for people to think about. The importance of including all relevant benefit, risk, and uncertainty information in lay terms through public websites, providing materials that can be accessible through an internet search, so making sure they're not buried. Frequently updating these materials to ensure they remain accurate, obviously avoiding any knowledge of misleading, and making sure that you're providing material facts. Include benefit information with risk information and vice versa. Allow direct access to more complete risk information where your space limitation means you can't include everything. Of course, I just skipped over, but didn't want to skip over, making sure that at least you're including the most serious risks up front, and making sure that risk information is as prominently displayed in a comparable way to benefit information. And if you can't communicate all the most important information around benefit and risk together in a certain on a certain platform or in a certain way, maybe reconsider whether that's the right platform to use. So in particular, if you're using character limited Twitter or some other place, recognizing that the brevity may mean you can't include all the information, it might not be the right format. Next slide. And then really importantly in here, we talk about the best practices for working with patient advocacy organizations to develop and make available these communications for patients and caregivers. Patient advocacy organizations are trusted, are highly trusted, and frankly, much more so than virtually any other stakeholder, except maybe a physician, in the ecosystem of medical practice. And they know their constituencies, they understand the needs of their constituencies, and they have incredible reach. So in the report, we do provide some information about how to do this work in building partnerships. A patient advocacy organization is probably not going to advance communication about a specific device, but they are likely to want to communicate about a class of devices or a treatment approach. And they, I think, will be willing partners in working on making sure these communications about benefit and risk and uncertainty are accessible. So here are these bullets about how to identify the best patient organizations to work with. It's very important when you work with patient advocacy groups to understand that they are your partners in this work, and not see them sort of as token voices or check the box. It's important to have guiding principles for how you work with patient groups. There are some bright lines and do's and don'ts. So there are some resources in the report about that. It's good to measure your impact to see how this work is going over time. And it's important to maintain open communication with them and keep an ongoing relationship. Next slide. So I've mentioned in this very high-level overview that the report includes a lot of resources. Just here visually so you can see, there are a number of FDA guidance documents and other very useful documents that speak to the view of the regulators on communicating benefit, risk, and uncertainty, on limited space communications, on use of patient preference information. So I encourage you to take a look at those. Additionally, MDIC has done some really foundational work on a variety of topics, and in particular in the patient preference world, with a very important report. The Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative and others, but Citi in particular, has published extensively on working with patient groups around clinical trials. And the National Quality Forum has done some very important work around shared decision-making and patient decision aids. Next slide. So I mentioned briefly when I was talking about patient decision aids that there are a number of important elements for successful communication in that realm. And here are 8 of them in a sort of best practice checklist that our group felt were really important for people to think about when they are designing these kinds of communications, and make sure that you are addressing these topics appropriately when you are developing communications. These 8 elements are going to be the foundation for our continuing work from MDIC in the upcoming, next slide, patient engagement forum virtual event on November 18th. And we are going to be talking in even more detail about the aspects of this communications report. And we are going to be offering the opportunity in small groups for hands-on learning and experience with some of these aspects and these recommendations. So if you're not already registered, I know we would love to have you join on November 18th. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my friend and colleague, Heidi Dohse, to provide the patient perspective on some of these concepts. Heidi?
Thank you, Wendy. I'd like to start out with just thanking MDIC and the SPI working group for really taking on this piece of work and publishing this very relevant and important document. As Liliana mentioned in the intro, I started my journey with medical devices back in 1983, and I was 19 years old. And the medical device, a pacemaker, was actually secondary to the number one concern I had as a patient, which was to go in for an experimental surgery to have an AV ablation. And in talking with my physician about the risk and the benefit of having this procedure, we never really thought much about what the device was going to be that was going to be implanted. I just knew that I was going to have a pacemaker. And back in 1983, we didn't have social media. There wasn't even a lot of information about devices being implanted in 19-year-old athletes either. So when I thought about what questions do I have, what can I add to the shared decision making, it was really along the lines of, what is this device going to look like in my chest? And this is some of the case study information that I was able to provide as part of this paper in looking back at when there isn't a framework to discuss a shared decision-making process with your physician. You don't know what you don't know, so you just make decisions on things that actually weren't the best way to make a decision. Knowing what I know today about pacemakers, I'm far more interested in the algorithms and the features for performance than I care about how it looks in my chest at this point. Next slide, please. So I wanted to talk about a little bit about how this document is very relevant, not just in the initial decision about a medical device, but that once we as patients start this journey, it's really for the rest of our lives. And so there's a patient life cycle or patient journey that needs to be incorporated into thinking through the medical device product life cycle. One of the other case studies that I was able to contribute to the white paper is in the how patients start to look at online information to begin to educate themselves. And that education starts when we either have symptoms that we're feeling and we want to get some information. So we, of course, we go to the internet, we do a search, and we start coming up with what do we think our symptoms might mean. Or we've been to the physician and we get a diagnosis for something and we start to look up, what does that mean? If that diagnosis includes a medical device, we oftentimes will start getting that information so that by the time we are looking at some sort of therapy, surgery, or procedure, we become educated. And at that point, it's really the value of this document is how do we help our healthcare providers work with us to be co-collaborators in that decision-making, understanding what the risks are, what the benefits are, and what those mean to not just our lifestyle in the next year or two, but in the next 10 to 20 years. So every time we get a device and we then go home, we then need to learn to manage and monitor what does this mean in the way we live our lives. And that process to build trust with our bodies, build trust with our devices, this is where you start to see a lot of the patients helping patients or the peer-to-peer conversations happening in many of the Facebook groups and chat rooms, things like that, where patients are helping one another try and figure out what to do with this new journey that they're on. And it would be great to bring more of the provider influence or input into those conversations. And that then leads to when it's time for us to get our next device, because I'm already on my 7th device, so I've been through this process a few times. You now have someone who's educated, they understand what it means to have a medical device and how this impacts their lifestyle. So they come in far more educated with really knowledgeable input and questions that can be asked and need to be taken into consideration, because oftentimes, because the medical device itself was developed as a single use, single experience, the unintended consequences of having one device removed and another device implanted, there's sometimes a misfit. In my experience, the first device back in the early days when they were really big, the pocket was big. The next device was much smaller. They implanted that device in the same pocket, to which about 18 months later, it had slid under my armpit and we had to take that one out and put in something completely different under the muscle in my chest muscle. So these are things that patients and physicians and feedback from patients that go through these processes over and over again can help to provide a better experience and feedback in how the products last or how they work from device to device, how to mitigate consequences so that in the future, people maybe can eliminate some of the extra devices or procedures they end up having due to the unintended consequences. And then really, this document is a great framework for taking patient input and feedback and repurposing that back into the product life cycle and into research and clinical trials, where as individuals, we can now have impact to make not only our own future devices better, but also to make the lives better and the devices better for everyone that may need something similar. So I just, again, want to thank MDIC for truly including the patient voice and allowing me to provide some case studies and feedback on this report. And I can confirm that it's incredibly useful from the patient perspective, and I think is a wonderful framework for helping device manufacturers, providers, and the healthcare ecosystem to really begin to create a patient collaborative. So just thank you.
And thank you, Heidi, and thank you, Scott and Wendy, for the excellent and informative presentations on the report. Now I would like to open it up for questions. Please submit your questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And while we wait for some questions, I would like to start with a question. Heidi, you were just talking about the case studies. So I wanted to ask Scott or anyone else if you could expand on the case studies. What was the purpose and who provided them?
I can start and say that we had excellent participation from the working group members, communications working group members, several of the companies, as well as Heidi and also Tour de Heart, providing just very brief, almost vignettes about experience with some of the aspects that we talk about in the report. We tried to bring to life some of these concepts to show how real people in a real company or in a real situation had been approaching these topics. And so they're not very detailed, they're just a couple of paragraphs each, but I was really delighted by the engagement and involvement of the members of the working group.
Thank you, Wendy. We actually have a question. Let me read that. Did you look into cybersecurity as a risk for medical devices in terms of how to discuss risk with patients?
So I'll tackle that one. And we did not specifically look at cybersecurity. And I can say that it did not show up in the literature review. That is a potential gap in not just in this report, but in what is known about communicating risk, benefits, and uncertainties to patients. I think Heidi as well might have some interesting insights, both as a patient and as an expert in the Internet of Medical Things.
Yes, so this question does come up relatively often in conversations, and I think that there's misinformation around cybersecurity. I don't know how many of you have seen, action shows where they talk about hacking somebody's medical device and aha, that's how the bad guy's going to get the hero. In reality, when we think about medical data security and and the weak points. So I have my medical device in my chest. I have a latitude communicator that passively can interrogate that device and collect information and then send that information to my physician. I have my medical records, and then I have my wearable consumer devices. So I have all this data and information that's being generated. I know there's potentially a risk that if someone wanted to focus on me to hack into the medical band, potentially into my pacemaker and override it, it could happen. I personally just don't see that as a very high risk compared to the many other decisions and benefits that are higher on my priority list. And when I talk with other pacemaker patients, that doesn't come up. I don't hear people worried about having their device hacked or anything. It's more around the data in general of medical, people having access to your medical records.
Thank you, Heidi. And actually, we do have an initiative at MDIC that looks into cybersecurity of medical devices. So if you're interested in learning more, you can go to our website and find out more. But since we're talking about,
really
yeah,
quick,
go ahead.
I think when it's better defined, it will then be easier to communicate. Right now, it's just such a big box of what does it mean? What does cybersecurity to medical data mean?
It is, yes.
Yeah.
And I think that's exactly what our initiative is working on.
And it will be super helpful.
Yeah, and since we're talking about potential gaps, I want to ask Scott if there were any other general gaps identified in the process that will benefit from further research, or Wendy.
Yeah, you know, patients are getting more and more of their information through non-traditional channels, right? Providers are still incredibly important, as is the device labeling, but more and more we see people turning to social media and to the internet. And there were relatively few studies that talked about how to best communicate through those channels, through social media channels. And I think that that's an area where some more research can be done to understand how do you make sure that the information that is communicated is accurate and is understandable by patients. So that's one potential gap that we found.
And I could just also say that more work definitely needs to be done, and this is referenced in the conclusion in the report, in terms of best practice for reaching vulnerable populations. We talked some about the characteristics of the patients that matter, and clearly literacy and digital literacy, age, and other demographic factors are really important, especially as we're moving to more and more online types of communication settings that we're talking about here. So I definitely think that this is an emerging field that requires additional work for the device space.
Thank you both. And since we're talking about social media, Wendy, as we know, patients and caregivers look to online sources for information about medical conditions and treatments, and this is what Heidi brought up. How should sponsors be seeking to leverage these opportunities to provide useful information about benefit risk for devices? Are there ways to address misinformation or partial information in these venues?
So absolutely. I mean, I think, the way that current technology works, both in terms of how ubiquitous it is and how significant it is in terms of a vast majority of people who seek health information do so online or through some type of channels, through social media or otherwise. So this is an area where I believe medical device sponsors have been focusing. I think that there are some guide rails that have been put up in terms of, what's appropriate and what is permissible at the varying stages of the life cycle of a device. So certainly making sure that you are, in compliance with those requirements is obviously number one. And then secondly, as we tried to discuss in the report, really understanding the platform, making sure that it's a way for you to be complete, but also to make the information accessible. I do think that there are opportunities for medical device companies maybe to take a page from their counterparts in the drug developer world, to use your own websites as a jumping off board to be more patient friendly, to be more accessible to patients with some of this type of information. And of course, making sure that you're continuing to monitor and update information, because as I said before, as I keep telling my children, things don't ever fully disappear from online, but you have to be vigilant to make sure that you're doing the best you can to keep information as updated as possible.
Can I add to what Wendy's saying? It's as a patient, we are very loyal to the brand and the devices and the manufacturers that make the devices that we have. And we would love to be able to find patient-friendly information on those websites. When there's a lack or a void of information, patients start they're still looking for information. It's just that they start getting access to bad information, non-curated information. And it never ceases to surprise me how often in these patient peer-to-peer Facebook groups and things like that, people are saying, here's my settings, you should try these. you know, it's like, wow, for lack of access to information, people start sharing really crazy information. And what we really want is this relationship with the people that make the devices that allow us to live each day. So I think Wendy's right. Good patient-friendly information that starts at the manufacturer would be great.
Yeah, and I would just add one other thing that we talk about in the report, which is that especially with some devices, patients may never see the actual packaging or label, physical label that comes with the device that they have, especially if it's been implanted through a surgical procedure. And so if they don't have that information, or they didn't get that information, or the doctor had it but it didn't transfer to them, you know, that also may be part of why they're going to search online. And so having access not only to that information, but distilled and more accessible versions of information that would be most important to them is something I think that people can continue to do better on.
Yeah, thank you. And I think, Wendy, you have touched on a couple of times that there's that you mentioned pharma. So we do have a question from the audience about, so did you identify any issues related to communication of benefit, risk, and uncertainties that are particularly relevant to devices and medtech as opposed to drugs?
So I think what I just said is one. So as opposed to the, you know, a drug that you might get from your pharmacist that comes with a piece of paper stapled on, you know, that's the label information. I suppose if you have an infused drug, maybe you might not see the label there, but certainly with an implantable device, in addition to maybe not seeing the package insert or the label, there's also a number of the issues that Heidi brought up about, you know, changes to the device or needing to have a new device, or if there is a recall. You know, those kinds of things are very much, I would say, device specific and require a level of communication about potential risk and uncertainty that might go beyond what you would need from a drug that, you know, washes out of your system in a certain period of time. So the permanence factor, I think, is fairly unique. I do think too, given the wide range of types of devices that are out there, you know, that thinking about communication is very much going to have to be specific to the type of device, the type of patient population that you're dealing with, you know, as you customize the way to communicate. And we certainly saw that in the literature. And I think that's very important. You know, it's important in the drug space, but I think maybe it has some extra complexities in the device space. So we certainly saw those things in our work.
I might add to Wendy's comment that shared decision making is a very important concept in the world of medical devices. To make sure that I mean, these are high stakes decisions, and not that taking a particular drug is lower stakes, but medical devices tend to be more permanent decisions than a drug. And so the idea of shared decision makings when you're considering a particular therapy option with a medical device, we wanted to make sure that we have tools as we prepare these shared decision making tools to discuss with patients. We want to make sure that we're communicating the risks, benefits, and uncertainties clearly in those shared decision making tools.
And I would just add one other thought, which again is not universal, but I think is something to consider, that the patient populations who use devices in some cases may not be as likely to be as connected to an organized patient advocacy community as we sometimes see in certain disease states where most of the therapies are drug-based. And so, you know, the opportunity to work with an organized and trusted patient advocacy organization may not be the same as what you might have in a community where you're working with say in oncology, for example, where you're developing drugs.
Right, and we do have a few minutes left, so I wanted to ask the last question to Heidi. Why should medical device manufacturers think about the patient journey life cycle in addition to the product life cycle?
Well, I think that it's really important, as I was mentioning when I was speaking, right now devices are designed and developed for like a single incident or a single therapeutic use or treatment. But the patient life cycle is that we need many of them. And we also, as we go through the journey as a patient, your first device, you're oftentimes in a different phase of mentally thinking about, am I safe? Am I fearful? What does my life look like? By the time you're on your third device, it's like, okay, how do I get performance out of this device? How do I continue on to my, the life I want to live? And what is the part this device plays in it? And how do I make sure that those devices are going to continue to be developed along with my journey as a patient? And I think that's an opportunity for the industry to start to look at bringing those two closer together, because right now there's a big disconnect between the patient life cycle and the product life cycle.
Yes. Well, we're actually out of time. So I want to thank Scott, Wendy, and Heidi, and thank you everyone for joining us for this MDICx webinar. I do want to remind everyone that we have resources available on our website. There you can download the report and find more information about our projects. And I think if we advance one slide, you can see the links. You can also find this and other MDIC webinars on the link in the screen. And we look forward to continuing to engage with all of you as we continue to make progress on the Science of Patient initiative. Have a wonderful day and a wonderful weekend. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Liliana.
Thank you, everybody.